Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Muriel, and in this video I am going to talk about my personal experience with mental illness. May is mental health, in my opinion, / mental illness awareness month, and since I marked the occasion with a couple of topic relevant videos last year, I thought I could do the same this year. Though, unlike last year, the videos uploaded today and in the following days will not be book related at all, or only minimally so. What I want to do here is share some, or a lot, of my personal lived experience and hopefully provide some information about mental illness, psychiatry, and neurodivergence in the process. I hope this will contribute to humanizing, personalizing the topic of mental illness and mental health, and perhaps give some answers to common questions some of you may have regarding this topic. In this first video, I will talk specifically about my history with and experience of mental illness and psychiatry, keep the autism talk for a second one, and I'd also like to make a video about my experience with abuse and subsequent trauma, but I doubt the latter two will go up at the same time as this first one. So yeah, they won't technically come out for Mental Health Awareness Month, but it's the thought that counts. Of course, feel free to completely ignore this type of content. It is not directly book related after all, and mine is first and foremost a booktube channel. But these are topics that are important to me, that are a part of me, and in all honesty, I'm also doing this for myself. And even though I don't do this when it comes to book content, I feel it is relevant and justified here to issue a content warning. I will be talking about mental illness, duh, but also self-harm, eating disorders, suicidality, and sexual trauma a little, just so we're all on the same page. Also, this is probably going to be a longer one, so section timestamps are your friends here. I thought I'd start with a rundown of my history with mental illness. I started struggling with poor mental health around the age of 10 or 11. I felt different even as a young child and had issues with social relationships at school. I was bullied for several reasons and became more and more of a loner as I grew up, but always performed well academically, so I was never brought to a shrink during my primary school years, even though I became increasingly anxious and depressed during my 6th and last year. Then I started secondary school and it all went to shit, basically. It was a big change, and I don't handle big changes well at all, something which makes more sense now given the ASD diagnosis. Social interactions became increasingly difficult, and by the spring of 2005, I developed school phobia. I cried every morning before going to school, begged my parents to keep me home, and eventually became very suicidal. They had taken me to a psychologist a few months earlier, and it was a massive failure, so they took me again to see another psychologist, but I didn't feel comfortable seeing her alone. She then directed my parents to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist advised my parents to have me hospitalized at the Children's Hospital. So I stayed on a children's psych ward for 7 weeks, then 2 more weeks the following summer because I self-harmed at home, and I was 12 at the time. The following year, I followed my school's curriculum at a distance at the Children's Hospital School, which is incidentally where I met my rapist, but more on that in a separate video, like I said, then reintegrated my original high school the year after, so 3rd year of secondary school. At the time, I was under the care of a psychiatrist, the one who'd advised my parents to send me to the Children's Hospital, an individual therapist, and a family one, the latter two holdovers from my stay at the hospital, until the age of 15 or 16, and I managed to finish my secondary schooling with no additional disruption. I didn't ever repeat a year, was top of my class in a few different subjects, and managed socially well enough. Though I frequently felt very depressed, very anxious, lonely, alienated, and self-harmed on and off. Things broke down again when I started university, and even though I'd become distrustful of shrinks for largely the wrong reason at the time, I agreed to see a psychiatrist again, who then supervised my care the following 8 years. Academically, my experience at uni was absolutely chaotic. I repeated my first year, not that big of a deal since a lot of students do, I suppose, passed my second year, then struggled again with my 3rd year. I failed once, tried again, but couldn't find the energy or motivation to go to class, felt depressed, anxious, etc. My doctor suggested I attend a day clinic this time, which I did for a year. It is also there I met my abusive ex, Philippe. But again, more on that in another video. Then I tried my 3rd year for a Third time, applied to have the course load spread out over 2 years because I learned you could do that. Didn't pass all the classes I'd selected for that first of 2 years and was refused readmission, though I got a medical exemption and tried again a fourth and final time. We're in 2016 at this point, and I'm 24 years old. I studied hard, also I thought, but my January exam results were really bad, and I lost all motivation again, not to mention self-confidence, not that I've ever had much of it to begin with. Beginning of 2017, I'm extremely depressed, aimless, and I'm advised to go to the hospital again. So I went to a clinic, which some of you might recall from some of my 2021 videos when I went back to that same clinic, for 7 weeks in the spring of 2017, accepted the fact there was no way I could possibly take all of the exams I would have to in order to pass my third year in one session the following summer, and abandoned my studies. In my country, in Belgium, after 3 tries, you become unfinanceable for 5 years, which basically means university becomes inaccessible. So I do not have any higher education qualifications despite trying to for 7 years. The hospital stay didn't accomplish much because it never does in my personal experience, more on that in a bit, but I followed the staff's advice and took a drawing class the following autumn. I took them for 3 years, which really were 4 years because of COVID, but I finished that 3-year cycle. My relationship with my doctor became increasingly strained. I eventually lost the trust I had in her, mostly because of medication and diagnostic errors, more on that in a bit as well, and I ditched her in 2018. I was relatively stable between the autumn of 2018 and the summer of 2019, so by that I mean mildly depressed and regularly anxious, but nothing I couldn't more or less manage as long as I didn't think about the future too much. Then my baby dinosaur, Lily, died in June of 2019. I also had growing problems with my ex, Philippe, whom I didn't yet realize was abusive towards me, and my world shattered, basically. Pain just geysered out of me, and the thing that tends to happen with me is that one trigger will lead all of the other things that fuel my depression and anxiety to resurface. Yay. By 2020, I was self-harming regularly, more than I ever did before. I was having anxiety attacks, panic attacks, and meltdowns regularly as well, and my mother, my blessed mother, insisted I seek professional help again, so I did. I found a psychiatrist who told me to get an IQ test, CBT with a colleague of his, and group therapy for social anxiety. I did the IQ test, which confirmed I am intellectually gifted. I did the individual therapy with a psychologist I stopped seeing this year. I tried the group therapy and it was a disaster. It made me feel awful, just awful, and I stopped after 4 sessions. It is also in 2020 that I finally realized I'd been raped and abused. I experienced a crisis with my ex Philippe during the summer, and in September my rapist reached out to me because he wanted to fuck me again. Yay. You can imagine I was in a terrible place mentally, just completely broken down. The psychic armor I'd built along my life was blown to absolute bits, and I went back to the hospital for 3 months between December of 2020 and March of 2021, which again, some of you may recall since I made a few videos from it. 2021 was not a good year for me either, and by September I felt hopeless, exhausted, and very suicidal again, even though I'd finally gotten an ASD diagnosis. Then my ex David happened, and things were a lot better for 5 months. I was full of hope again, and full of love and good feelings, until it all crashed back into hell because of him. Again, as some of you may be aware of, given what I've talked about in my last reading wrap-up. I'm not in a good place now, to say the very least. Again, as some of you may know from what I've talked about in my last 2 monthly reading wrap-ups, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Treatment-wise, I am currently taking medication, more about that later, and seeing a psychotherapist who has experience treating patients who are on the spectrum. A rare find in my neck of the woods. That being said, I'm still sort of shopping around for someone better, but again, more about psychotherapy specifically later. I am officially recognized as being disabled as well, have been since early this year, and yes, I am lucky, privileged enough to receive disability benefits. Though, believe me, I still suffer from imposter syndrome a lot. Diagnoses-wise, I have autism. Yes, not technically a mental illness, but More on that in my second video. I suffer from clinical depression, which is chronic since I have experienced it to varying degrees since I was an older child. I also suffer from chronic anxiety, and I personally believe from some sort of C-PTSD, so complex PTSD. The latter is not an official diagnosis, but I believe it fits my experience given the trauma I've gone through. I have previously been diagnosed with social anxiety specifically, and I suppose this diagnosis still technically fits. However, I believe it is in large part due to the autism, and as such, it's less an irrational fear. Not that there always has to be an irrational fear per se, but it's more a sensical, acquired response from stressful, even traumatic situations, social situations I've experienced in my life, my formative years especially. As a child, the team at the Children's Hospital misdiagnosed me with psychotic personality structure, which isn't even a psychiatric medical diagnosis. It's some bullshit concept derived from psychoanalytical theory. And as an adult, I was half-heartedly misdiagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder by my psychiatrist at the time, even though I've never experienced mania or even hypomania, rather what I'll call special interest obsessiveness and poor interoception due once again to being neurodivergent. But misdiagnoses are very, very common in late diagnosed autistic women. But again, more on that in my second video. An anxiety disorder is defined as persistent and overwhelming anxiety that causes disruptions in the life of the sufferer, leading one to avoid usual situations and activities, for example. There are several kinds of anxiety disorders, such as generalized and social anxiety disorder. There's also panic disorder and phobias. In all honesty, I'm not entirely sure what precise type of anxiety disorder I suffer from at this point, though I do have a phobia of bees and wasps. I like them as insects, but I freak out if I see one. But I definitely feel anxiety in social situations, so I experience some sort of social anxiety, but I do think it's largely autism related. I am a worrywart, yes, and feel immense amounts of anxiety whenever my mind strays to thoughts of the future and my survival. This has been the case since I was a child and realized my parents would die before everyone else is at school. I mean, that's what I thought at the time, given the relatively advanced age they were when I was born. And, you know, kids at school would always point out, oh, your parents are so much older. Are they your grandparents? Kids are assholes. Anxiety also has a very strong physical component. I experience it as a weight, or I picture it as a kind of black hole, a vortex of negative energy and tension in the middle of my chest, right beneath the sternum here, where the solar plexus chakra would be, if you're familiar with that stuff. When anxiety accumulates, when the distressing thoughts, ruminations become faster and louder in my head, I often conceptualize it in terms of sound for some reason. Maybe that's because I have earworms all the bloody time and I'm very music sound oriented. It can lead to anxiety attacks or even panic attacks or, well, meltdowns when other emotions become involved. I have to be honest here, I have a hard time precisely distinguishing between some anxiety, panic, or even terror attacks and an autistic meltdown now that I know I'm autistic. In retrospect, things that I thought were anxiety attacks were actually probably meltdowns, but there's overlap between those things. In my experience, anxiety attacks involve accelerated heartbeats, accelerated breathing, even hyperventilation, and heat flashes. I get hot very easily and sweat very easily. A panic attack goes even further in that I start feeling pins and needles in my extremities and I start feeling really dizzy. I remember clearly thinking something was terribly wrong and I'd need to go to the hospital when I had a severe one about 2 years ago. I mean, some people think they're dying, so it's that kind of what the hell is happening to me feeling. Then terror attacks, that's something I personally coined, and honestly the more I think about it, the more I believe it is just a specific kind of meltdown during which I feel just completely overwhelmed by thoughts/emotions, fear primarily among them, and I just kind of curl up into a shaking ball. In those moments, I cannot be touched, and I'm convinced I'm going to be hurt, and I feel like I'm legitimately losing my mind. It's horrible. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. Depression might, in my opinion, be trickier to precisely define than pathological anxiety. So depression causes feelings of sadness and or a loss of interest in activities you once enjoyed. It can lead to a variety of emotional and physical problems and can decrease your ability to function at work and at home. That's one definition I found, and it's not inaccurate, but it falls woefully short of really conveying what depression is or does to sufferers. I've also come across several sources now arguing depression really is more of an umbrella term or diagnosis, or that it should be seen as such, because it probably covers several different conditions with different etiologies and symptomatic profiles, and I tend to agree with that. For example, there's already a big split of sorts between the people who feel depression robs them of all emotions and those, like me, who feel depression drowns them in negative emotions, so too much negative emotion. Depression robs me of positive emotion, robs me of hope, motivation, and I am left drowning in pain, sadness, despair. For some, also add anger to the mix as well, especially in men, according to some clinical statistics I've seen, though it can be the case for women as well, obviously. What is recurrent in descriptions of depression, however, is anhedonia and abulia. So, one, a loss of pleasure in usually pleasurable things you normally enjoy, hobbies, things like that. The second, a loss of motivation to do usually pleasurable or at least habitual things. Appetite is usually affected, either going up or down. In my case, it tends to go down. So is sleep, either leading to insomnia or hypersomnia. I tend to have, I guess, a bit of both. My sleep's always been wonky anyway, but for now it's definitely hypersomnia. I sleep way too much and I'm still tired. Executive function can also be affected, leading to memory impairment, loss of focus, etc. This has definitely been my experience, though I've also learned that autism affects executive function. So I guess my executive dysfunction is potentially a result of both conditions. One of the most awful things about depression is that it can even affect your relationship to love. By that, I mean, it's not that it stops you from loving the people you love. You're not just going to stop loving, I don't know, your friends, your partner, your parents, your siblings, but it makes accessing the love you feel more difficult. You're kind of cut off from that because you're just submerged in psychic pain. And realizing this actually made me wonder if my ex, David, didn't experience that same thing right before what he did to me. I'm convinced he was very depressed. He was stopping his antidepressant way too quickly, and he was also very stressed because of several different things. And this might have made it easier for him to compartmentalize his feelings for me and break up with me and then treat me like utter garbage. I might just be reaching here to cope. I'm willing to admit that, but it's still a possibility. Of course, I also think he had some sort of personality-altering psychotic break, and besides, none of that excuses his incredibly cruel and gaslighting behavior towards me, since I've gone through the same kinds of feelings and never used it as an excuse to act like a bitch towards my mother, for example, or to him, but still, it might partly explain what happened, though it doesn't lessen the horribleness and pain of it, obviously. To try and relate all of this back to literature just a little, I would personally recommend The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, Magicians by Lev Grossman, and Or Darkness Visible by William Styron if you want to see what it feels like to experience depression. The first two are novels, and I've very recently done a review for the second. And the third is a memoir that I strongly related to personally, but all show what depression can be like for sufferers, so I would definitely recommend all of them. I do not suffer from an eating disorder now, but I have experience with disordered eating and started developing an eating disorder between the ages of 13 and 14. Anorexia/orthorexia, to be more specific. If you don't know what orthorexia is, it's a need to eat healthily, correctly, at all costs. I don't think it's mentioned as much as bulimia, hyperphagia, or anorexia, but it's also a thing. It does often pair up with anorexia, but so that's what that is. This is also quite common actually among autistic girls and women, I've learned. And yes, eating disorders are more common in females. I don't think the literature has changed on that, but I could be wrong. But it most certainly does occur in boys and men as well. When I was on the psych ward in 2021, there were 2 men on my ward, and they were there for an eating disorder. And on a more personal level, my childhood best friend suffers from hyperphagia and bulimia, has since he was a teenager, and actually even my ex David has hyperphagic episodes. He kind of alternates between eating next to nothing and then binging the worst of junk food, though, not to the degree of an actual eating disorder proper. Like me, it's more that his eating patterns are disordered. Sure, I'm playing around with semantics, but there is a difference in my head. To me, the difference is significant. My eating patterns are still disordered in that whilst I have a relatively healthy perception of my appearance, at least compared to a lot of people, women, from what I can garner, and thankfully that's like one of the few things that isn't fucked in my head, I do get stressed about not being able to control my weight and stressed about eating healthily. That's kind of the orthorexic aspect. So I will deprive myself of food easily, even though I have absolutely zero need to diet. In fact, I'm slightly underweight. But I also have low appetite naturally, though it's gone down even from that because of depression, and I easily forget to eat because of poor interoception because of autism. But again, more on that in the autism video. So yes, lots of things are intertwined here. When I was 13, 14, however, I clearly was on the path to developing an actual eating disorder, and I've met a lot of sufferers during my various stays on a psychiatric ward. No, eating disorders such as anorexia aren't just caused by a desire to be thin. I don't know if this still needs to be said. Well, no, I know for a fact that this still needs to be said because some people still think that's what that's all about, or an inability to see oneself as thin. Yes, that's the case for some sufferers. Some sufferers have something called body dysmorphia, where they're incapable of seeing themselves as they actually are. And yes, eating disorders can start from excessive dieting. That was kind of the case with my childhood friend. But other sufferers, however, will starve themselves, or conversely, stuff themselves to cope with, for example, sexual trauma. There will often be sexual trauma in the histories of anorexic or bulimic patients. In fact, one of the anorexic patients I met in the hospital had been gang raped as a teenager. Others will binge or starve to feel they have control over something in their life, a control over their body, their biology, which can also then be tied to sexual trauma. That was more my case. I didn't not eat because of sexual trauma, even though I kind of had some, but again, more on that in another video. But I was overweight as a child, and I didn't like the way I looked as a child. I hated being a child. It's the whole thing anyway. So when I hit puberty, I started losing weight. I started being a lot thinner, more like I am today. And so to me, being pudgy was like being a child again, and I didn't want that. So I needed to be thin, I needed to stay thin, so I needed that control over my life. And in some cases, picky eating can simply be due to sensory processing issues, like in autism. Complex PTSD is different from regular PTSD in that it results from experiencing periods of ongoing trauma from abuse, for example, or a series of traumatic events, such as emotional or sexual abuse, and results in slightly different symptoms, such as emotional dysregulation or psychosomatic ailments. As I've stated before, I don't have an official diagnosis of C-PTSD, though the psychiatrist I saw at the hospital in 2021 said I clearly suffered from trauma. So there you have it. Besides, I don't even think Francophone shrinks even know of C-PTSD as a diagnosis yet, given how far behind they are the Anglosphere when it comes to such things. But again, another debate for another day. It really became obvious to me that I, in fact, suffered from trauma with a bit of delay, I guess, or a lot of delay, when I had my huge breakdown at the end of 2020. I started somatizing intensely and dissociating more than I usually do, though more on that in my autism video once again. And by somatizing, what I mean is that your psychic pain gets directly expressed physiologically through your body. So in my case, I developed back pain. I mean, I also stuck a muscle or something in my back, but it was made a lot worse by my psychic state. Had neck pain from all the tension, and just pains all along the left side of my body specifically for some reason. Dissociation-wise, my hands felt like they belonged to someone else. I would look at my hands and it's like, what are these things? And I wasn't high, I promise, I wasn't high. And honestly, that still sometimes happens to me. It's weird. It's not even that distressing at this point, it's just really freaking weird. It can be my whole arm arm. My arm is just laying on my leg and it's like, that's my arm. And I barely feel it as my arm. Anyway, my body felt like a lump of rotten flesh, spoiled meat, that general imagery. I looked at myself in the mirror and I couldn't recognize myself. Fun fact, when I rewatch some of my videos, it kind of weirds me out that that's me, but I'll get back to that in my autism video. And I also had issues regarding sexual fantasies and stuff of that general nature. The latter were actually mostly fixed by my ex David. Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a cliche, not terribly feminist of me, to say that the love of a good man, or a good man at the time in any case, helped so much, but that was my experience. You know, sexual healing and all that. Anyway, of course, the little trust I acquired was dashed to pieces again, and sexuality-wise, well, they're still things, shall we say. Not that it matters, given I'm single now. I also still have nightmares, semi-regularly, and in any case, incessant dreams about my various exes, like all the bloody time. I'm just haunted. That's how I see it at this point. I'm just bloody haunted. My memory integration honestly feels shot to me. I mean, I know for a fact that PTSD, C-PTSD, it has a lot to do with like emotionally charged memory filing, memory integration, so it kind of makes sense. But yeah, it's a pain to say the least. But again, more on that in a separate video. Self-harm describes any behavior where someone causes harm to themselves, usually as a way to help cope with difficult or distressing thoughts and feelings. This includes cutting oneself, burning oneself, hitting oneself, but things like substance abuse can also be considered self-harm, as can sex actually. Some common myths about self-harm. Only teenagers do it. Those who start doing it as teenagers will naturally grow out of it, i.e. it's just a phase. Self-harm is done to get attention. The truth is, however, people of all ages self-harm. Example here. Even elderly people, both men and women, do it. There's also kind of this stereotype that like emo teenage girls cut themselves, but boys and men also self-harm. Some people never stop doing it, or stop and start again at different times in their lives. Also, it is not always done to get attention or not exclusively to get attention. And even if it is done to get attention, the person, whether teenager, adult, or elderly person, doing it still needs help and is deserving of your basic human compassion. Thank you. Some people self-harm because the physical pain offers relief from their psychic pain. Some people self-harm to punish themselves, some to feel alive, to feel something, some to prevent themselves from committing suicide, others, and this might be a bit controversial, but that's my opinion, others as a stepping stone to suicide. That's why you should take self-harm seriously, though it's not always an indicator that the person is going to commit suicide. And some do it to, once again, feel a sense of control over their lives. In most instances, in any case, just like the definition said, it is a coping mechanism, albeit an unhealthy one, that, according to research, actually releases endorphins, which can then make it addictive to a certain extent, but it also depends on the person, obviously. I started self-harming, cutting, to be more specific, at the children's hospital when I was 12 years old. I saw another patient doing it and decided to try it for myself, and I never really kicked the habit, so to speak. Though it's not really an addiction for me, as I don't necessarily feel the need to do it every day to feel good. It's not a fix I need to get, and I'm also quite good at impulse control. I don't have what they call an addictive personality. I'm quite lucky in that respect, I suppose. But it is a coping mechanism that I reach for easily when I'm in a lot of pain and winds are howling in my head. Told you, I conceptualize a lot of this in terms of sound for some reason. I did it again shortly after what happened with David, and I often want to do it just as I go to bed currently, but I'm ironically too tired to go through the ritual of it. Because yes, for me, it's a ritual of sorts, where it's not so much the physical pain I find soothing, but seeing blood flow from freshly made cuts. Sorry if that's a bit graphic, but I'm being transparent here. Though the throbbing pain afterwards is calming as well, and I assume that's largely due to those endorphins. I don't personally do it to get attention. I try to conceal it from my parents. I mean, they know I do it. I'm an adult, what they're gonna do, but I don't, shove it in their faces. I don't think about them or anyone else when I do it. I do it for me. So for me, it's more a question of exerting control and and once again calming the storms in my mind. Another bit of controversial content, I suppose, but it is mildly effective, though obviously, disclaimer, don't do it, or rather, the more intelligent disclaimer, if you are going to hurt yourself, please exercise harm reduction. Go on the internet, look how to care for wounds. If you can try and avoid doing it, do so, but if you are going to do it, let's be realistic here, at least exercise harm reduction, please. And thank you. Also, some people feel very ashamed of their cuts or burns and subsequent scars. They try to hide them or have them covered with tattoos even. It's not an uncommon practice, but I don't feel ashamed of my self-harming. I don't feel ashamed of my scars. My scars are what they are, and whilst I do plan on having several tattoos, I'll be getting my first tattoo in about a month, none of them will cover my scars because they are a part of who I am. They tell a part of my life story, however long it lasts. So yeah. Finally, I'd like to stress something, that if someone you know, someone you love even, is harming themselves, cutting themselves, burning themselves, something else, I assure you they are not doing it to hurt you, to upset you, to distress you, or to blackmail you emotionally. That can happen, especially with some personality disorders, but there are probably other issues with that if you are in that kind of relationship. It's a minority of cases. Most of the time, a person harms themselves because they are hurting, plain and simple, and it has nothing to do with you. Nothing. So additionally, because that happens when you love someone, don't feel bad, don't feel guilty, you did nothing wrong. Just try and be there for the person, support them, get them help. I say this because both my exes, Philippe and David, said pretty disgusting things to me involving my cutting. Philippe was abusive, so I mean, part of the pattern. He said I cut myself to make him feel bad, because he always brought everything back to his narcissistic self. And David, sadly, said something similar after our breakup and he turned into a monster, even though I stopped cutting myself when we were together. So what he said was just an abject lie. So yeah, that was pleasant. Not. A quick note about suicidal feelings and suicidal ideation. So suicidal feelings and thoughts, it's kind of wanting to die, thinking about dying, about killing yourself. Suicidal ideation, I think the definition is actually, having a plan and basically committing suicide. I'm not entirely sure though. I'm just kind of going off of my own personal definitions here. It's very common in mental illness in any case, and I am intimately familiar with both. Wanting to die is so familiar, in fact, that it honestly doesn't faze me as a subject in media and conversations. Suicide is a thing. It's not to say that I don't take it seriously, but I don't know, I just don't get easily upset by that subject. I'll definitely never judge someone who tells me they want to die. I'll listen to them because I understand. And I won't necessarily freak out either though, because I know there are degrees of intensity when it comes to suicidal feelings. Some people don't know how to handle those conversations, is kind of my point. But I know you can want to die and you're nowhere near actually planning to off yourself. Sorry. See, the stuff is not, that's just the way I talk about it, okay? And this is another thing. You can both want to live and die at the same time. You can also not want to live and not quite want to die at the same time. I personally picture the whole thing, the desire to live and the desire to die, as two different gauges, basically, and they can independently go up and down. Basically, the super dangerous red zone is when both the want to live gauge is down, completely down, and the want to die gauge is completely up. That's when you should be really, really freaking worried. So I've never actually attempted suicide, but there have been a few times when I came very, very close to doing so. I had a method planned out. I mean, I have a method. Don't freak out, but yes, I do have a method just in case. I have an exit strategy is what I call it. And I assure you there are lots of people, mentally ill people, who have something similar, I'm convinced. I know people who have attempted suicide. My ex Philippe attempted suicide 3 times. He joked that, well, it just didn't work with him, so he would never try again. We have a lot of dark humor, just, it's a thing. My grandmother also attempted suicide a few times in her life, and my ex David came very close to hanging himself a couple of years before he met me. So yes, suicidality is something I know, I really know and understand particularly well. I still feel suicidal basically every day. I feel suicidal before I fall asleep. I basically cry and want to die before I fall asleep. And then during the day, I'm pretty much functional. So work in progress, basically. Also, I've never tried suicide helplines. I have no idea if they do any good or not. But I do think it's an inexcusable shame that a lot of them only have calling on the phone as an option when a lot of mentally ill, neurodiverse people especially, have a hard time using the phone, myself included. You should at least have a chatting option on the computer, like, hello, think outside the box here. Anyway, mini rant over. As I've stated, I have a decent chunk of experience when it comes to psychiatric hospitals/clinics, and I would like to talk a little bit about this. Like everything else, psych wards and units have moved forward into the 21st century. Not everywhere, true, it kind of depends on the country, the socio-economic health of the area, and yes, they could use a shit ton of improvements. I'm the first one to say it, largely because psychiatry itself needs a shit ton of improvements. But by and large, asylums aren't the horror show staples they once were, especially when it comes to voluntary hospitalizations. I have been both to a state hospital as a child and a private one as an adult, and honestly the biggest difference between the two was that the food and rooms were much nicer at the latter. Also, you know, the whole I was an adult in charge of my own care thing, so they couldn't just mess me around as much as when I was a child. That being said, I did have a negative experience at the children's hospital, largely because the staff was still very much hopped up on psychoanalytical bullshit, which to be fair is still a problem in a lot of European francophone psychiatry. It withheld psychometric information from my parents, which talk about a breach of medical ethics, and they, you know, did fucking nothing about the predator who worked at the hospital school I went to, even though they knew about him. To be fair here again, that's on the hospital as a whole, I suppose, not just the psych unit, but I'm still salty about it, so fuck them. I could add missing the whole autism thing too, but it was the early aughts in French-speaking Belgium, and I was an intellectually gifted girl, so I basically had no chance of being diagnosed at the time, let's be real. Nowadays, they do have a unit specializing in ASD and ADHD, so ideally hope things have massively improved in the near 20 years I've been there. Apart from that, you know, it wasn't a torture chamber or anything. Just like with adult psychiatry, it had activities, psychotherapy, appointments, etc. My experience at La Ramée, the psych clinic I went to in 2017 and 2021, and at Le Quotidien, the day clinic I went to between 2015 and 2016, was, however, better. Though I was in a terrible state in 2021 especially. The staff, however, was especially kind and supportive, especially when things exploded between me and Philippe, because yes, he was there while I was there, and while our relationship was going through its last death throes. That wasn't a good time. Otherwise, honestly, in my experience, hospital stays don't really do much in terms of treatment. They can help you rest in a sheltered environment, take a break from the world, if you will, and maybe put things, therapy structures, things like that in place when you go back to the outside world, especially if you have a relatively normal life, I guess. But for complex and chronic cases like mine that don't neatly fit into one clear diagnostic box, largely a waste of time. And for those of you curious about what goes on inside a psych clinic, well, I already said a little bit about the children's hospital, but basically you get a psychiatrist you see once or twice a week depending on your needs, a psychologist, an individual psychologist you see about twice a week, that's been my experience. Sometimes they'll add a family therapist if it's considered necessary, and you get a reference nurse for additional emotional support on the daily and to resolve issues you may have with day-to-day life at the clinic or hospital you're staying in. Depending on why you're there, or your age, or things like that, there may be mandatory activities such as group therapy. Otherwise, there will most often than not be an occupational therapy center you can do stuff at, artistic activities, theater, music, watching a movie, discussing topics, things like that, or a gym you can do exercise or things like meditation in. There are also always regular doctors on staff, there are physiotherapists you can consult for massages or physiotherapy, whatever. There are social workers there to help you out with administration, if you need disability, if you need to find a new job, a new school, etc. And of course, the standard practice is to run blood work, run an EEG, an ECG. Sometimes they'll make you do a sleep lab, depending again on why you're there. And so I've never seen a padded cell anytime I've been on the psych ward. However, at the clinic I stayed at in 2017 and 2021, there was on each floor a locked supervised room where they would put severely suicidal patients for their own safety so they could be more closely monitored. As an aside, however, as a kid, when I was at the children's hospital, there was another patient, a boy, who was forcefully restrained and sedated during an episode of some sort. He was screaming, but that's the only extreme thing I've ever witnessed. Nothing like that since then. My relationship to psychiatry, mainstream psychiatry at least, is complicated, to say the least. I've become naturally distrustful of psychologists, psychiatrists, and even more so of psychopharmaceutical drugs, most notably because of the psychiatrist I had between the ages of 18 and 26. Also because of the shrinks I had at the children's hospital, but I hated them because they interfered with my relationship with my rapist, which in hindsight, that was the correct response, but of course I didn't realize that at the time anyway. So yeah, as a psychiatrist I had between the ages of 18 and 26 who misdiagnosed me with bipolar 2 and ran me through a slew of medications, including highly dosed antipsychotics that fucked with my short-term memory and made me gain 21 kilograms. To my American friends, UK friends, sometimes you use the metric system, sometimes you don't. It's confusing, but feel free to convert that in what I call non-civilized units, no offense. A lot of weight, basically, and including antidepressants such as Prozac, which blunted my emotions and made it difficult to cry or have lucid dreams. It might not sound like a big deal, but not being able to cry when you want to cry is freaking horrid, and I enjoyed having lucid dreams. It's kind of one of my natural gifts, and not being able to do that was shite. I'm a big believer in the therapeutic potential of cannabis and more so psychedelics. I'm not shy about this. I made a video about books about that topic last year for Mental Health Awareness Month. You can check it out if you wish. But these things are by and large still illegal. I mean, cannabis in any case is illegal in Belgium and in most of Europe. And I was basically on suicide's doorstep, not to put too fine of a point on it, after David ripped my heart and soul to shreds. So in extremis, I agreed to take medication again in the short term. So I currently take escitalopram, also known as Lexapro or Cipralexa, an SSRI antidepressant. I take a low dose, 50 milligrams of quetiapine, also known as Seroquel, a second-generation antipsychotic, and I have an extended release formulation of alprazolam, also known as Xanax, a benzodiazepine, which I take as needed. So I don't take it automatically, just when I feel the need to, if I'm extremely anxious, or I take an hour and a half to fall asleep. Now, I've tried most SSRIs on the market in the past, including fluoxetine, also known as Prozac, sertraline, also known as Zoloft, and paroxetine, also known as Paxil, and I don't have much faith in them. But escitalopram does seem to help by blunting my emotions, including the negative and very, very painful ones. So that's overall a positive. In any case, I don't seem to have any significant side effects for now, so yay. I'm pretty sure I've also tried duloxetine or Cymbalta, an SNRI, a more recent class of antidepressants. So SSRI stands for serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. SNRI stands for serotonin noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors. And those also include venlafaxine or Effexor, the antidepressant David was on, which he stopped too quickly, and which is also famously very, very difficult to get off. It's pretty well known that antidepressants actually aren't that effective overall, and have in fact more of an action on anxiety than depression per se. But I could rant about this for hours, and nobody wants that. Antipsychotics, on the other hand, are outright poisonous molecules at high and regular doses. Yes, I said it. They'll fuck up your liver, your metabolism, make you gain a shit ton of weight, and make you more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Yay! Nasty shit, in short. The older generation ones also cause a thing called extrapyramidal symptoms, which include akathisia, which is why some schizophrenics display wonky neuromotor function. Also nasty shit. But okay, fine, they can help in some instances. Ideally, they should be kept short term, however, and yes, psychosis is that main instance, right? So I had decided I would never touch the stuff again after gaining 21 kilograms on Seroquel precisely, but it turns out very low dose antipsychotics can really help autistic people with sensory overload and racing thoughts. And they don't have the nasty metabolic side effects higher doses do. So I agreed, and I can confirm my weight hasn't gone up on my daily 50 milligrams. If anything, I've lost some weight, but I do remain very watchful. Other second-generation antipsychotics include risperidone, Abilify, that's the brand name, not the molecule, but I couldn't be asked to find the molecule name for you, sorry. I invite you to look it up. And Zyprexa, I think that's olanzapine. Either Abilify or Zyprexa is olanzapine. I actually took some risperidone as well when I was 12 years old at the Children's Hospital to calm self-harming urges did absolutely jack shit. And you should have seen the psychiatrist who signed my ASDDX's face when I told her that. She was shocked. I mean, she didn't say anything, but she was shocked that they gave risperidone to a 12-year-old. So yeah, antipsychotics, along with anticonvulsants like lamotrigine, or I mean, that's the molecule Lamictal, it's called in English, which I also took for a while, are also used as mood regulators for the treatment of bipolar disorder, like lithium, though lithium is its own thing, which is why I was given Seroquel in the first place. Then you have benzos, good old benzodiazepines, or anxiolytic medications, Xanax, Ativan, Valium, and a fair few others. In my experience, these are actually the most effective at what they're meant to do, which is to calm you down, lessen your anxiety. But they are very addictive. Yes, and they should be taken sparingly. It's quite easy to develop a benzo addiction, and apparently, from what I've been told, it's one of the most horrific addictions to treat. But I personally trust them the most, ironically, precisely because I know exactly what their dangers are and what they do when I take them. I know my poison, basically, with them, so yes. Of course, I would like to make it clear that I don't judge anyone who takes medication. I'm taking medication currently, and I don't judge anyone else who wants to take medication, who takes medication, who chooses to take medication for years. It's your body, and you have the right to do whatever you think is best with it, with your mind. So I do not judge you. I'm very wary of those drugs. I think their effectiveness is subpar, but if they've done absolute miracles for you, I am glad for you, and, you know, discuss this with your doctor, etc. Though I would encourage doing research yourself as well, because knowledge is power, especially when you're in a vulnerable position, such as being mentally ill. Though, of course, if you're in the thick of it, you probably don't have the energy to do any research, but you get my meaning, I hope. So yes, do what you want with your body. I will not judge, but do your research. It's always useful to have the knowledge. Anyway, I've also been in therapy several times, and it never did much for me either. I've gone through what I assume must have been a type of psychodynamic psychotherapy, so that's psychotherapy derived from psychoanalysis. There's lots of focus on your parents with that, basically, to put it very simplistically. I went through a flexible kind of CBT, so with my old shrink, it was CBT, but she picked from other things as well. She used a bit of schematic Jungian theory. That sounded interesting, but then she did nothing with that. I was a bit confused. She just, kind of picked stuff from different branches of psychotherapy, but she was mainly trained as a CBT psychotherapist with exercise sheets to identify your emotions and shit. Okay. I've also tried hypnotherapy for sexual trauma-related stuff with 2 separate practitioners, and it was a complete bust. And I've also tried group therapy for social anxiety, which was a disaster because I'm autistic. And actually the doctor who supervised the group spotted my autism, so I am mightily grateful there. So unlike a lot of other mentally ill YouTubers, or, by that I mean YouTubers who are open about struggling with mental health and going to therapy, etc., I'm not going to be all positive here and say you should definitely try therapy if you're feeling down or anxious. Nope, because I'm very skeptical of it, quite simply. Of course, I am autistic, the big elephant in the room which I didn't even know was there for most of my life, and that can significantly affect how effective therapy turns out to be. More on that here. I'm not discouraging, once again, anyone from trying therapy. It does work for some people, and more power to them, but yes, it hasn't done much for me overall. That being said, I now see a therapist who has experience with ASD, and I think that's probably one of the key things. I really need to find a therapist who knows their shit when it comes to my specific issues, namely ASD and trauma as well. So yeah, I think that's key. I also think I've found a decent psychiatrist who knows about ASD, which is semi-miracle in my country at this point, and asked me, the patient, what I thought about medication and whether or not I felt it helped me. Imagine that! A psychiatrist who treats you like an adult and with respect. Yes, I am being a smidge sarcastic here, but there are a lot of garbage shrinks out there, trust me, and I have my fair share of unresolved anger where psychiatry is concerned. I would also like to try EMDR at one point because it's a short-term treatment for something specific, trauma, that has a lot of evidence behind it. So, I do have a name of a therapist to try, so I will probably do that in the near future and hope that it actually measurably helps. I am psychiatrically disabled. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with that, and I still have massive imposter syndrome on the regular, but it's the truth. There are things I can't do or cannot do easily, and this is disabling. The fucky thing too is that the things that are disabling can fluctuate, depending on my state of mind or mood, which can then affect my executive functioning, along with the autism. It's not stable disability, if that makes sense. And so that's also why it can be difficult to get it recognized by the state, to get aids. Not even just like money, but aids at work or at school. Because they'll say, but that day you were fine. Yeah, but the day before I was in bed all day and I couldn't do anything at all. So yeah, that's a thing. However, it's the constant fatigue, especially, that I find most disabling and annoying to deal with. I am tired all the time. My sleep has never been very restorative, for one thing, though I apparently don't have pathological levels of bad sleep, but I've never woken up a day in my life feeling rested. True story. My baseline is tired. Though again, the autism probably has a lot to do with it. You know, this whole thing with spoons. I used to have the image of a gas tank. I don't know why a gas tank, because I don't even like cars and I don't drive, but whatever. And it's like, not only is my gas tank never full, but it's not very good at extracting energy from the fuel. Or I used to joke that I had a defective mitochondria, because mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, ha ha ha. But yes, and then I realized that actually chronic fatigue is very common in autism because we're exhausted by sensory overload, social interactions, and stuff. So I was like, well, that kind of makes sense now. But it's still bloody annoying, and I still largely don't know what the hell to do with that. Speaking of which, knowing now that I am autistic makes sense of quite a few things, including my history and struggle with mental illness. So many things have become entangled after, 30 years of life, and it's not always easy to know exactly what caused this, what caused that. Mental illness does kind of run through the maternal side of my family, so does neurodivergence to a certain extent. My grandmother especially, so that's my mother's mother, I really believe she was probably autistic, but she definitely was severely depressed and anxious most of her life, and she tried to commit suicide several times. She was in the hospital several times. She took lithium, she took Valium. So genetics definitely play a part in my history. I'm convinced of that, but so does trauma. So do, I assume, some of my personality traits, my susceptibility to certain things which themselves are tied into the autism, and of course their unique life events. Bio, psycho, social. That's what mental illness is most often, after all. But so yes, I will go more in depth with the autism and the trauma abuse stuff in separate videos. This has been a long one, so thank you if you've decided to watch all the way through. I am open to obviously respectful questions about any of the subtopics I mentioned in this video. Happy to inform, whether it's about my personal experience or whether it's about the knowledge I've gathered about mental illness, medications, things like that, though obviously keep in mind I am not a doctor. I hope this video was informative. I hope it shows that you can be mentally ill and not, you know what I mean, crazy. Like, I am still me. I think sometimes I think I am a decent person. I don't do crazy shit like in the movies, so yes, but I do live with a disability and with medical conditions that make life really freaking tough at times. But in any case, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all quite soon in another topic-related video. Bye-bye.